sure I'm connected. 5 seconds, so that others who look at this tape will know who we've got. 5, 4, 3, 2.
I want to talk to you a little bit about my experience in Germany, but to put that in perspective, I want to begin talking about my mother's family. They lived in Germany for hundreds of years before I came into the world, and I'm fortunate to have some photographs that my mother and eventually my wife saved, and I'll be talking a little bit about each of these. So the first one I want to talk about is this 4-generation photo. It was taken in 1904 and shows my mother, a little kid, probably 9 months old, 8 months old, sitting on the lap of a very old lady. That turns out to be her great-grandmother. And it demonstrates clearly that this family was in Germany. This photograph is taken in some backyard area. And then the other women are her mother and her grandmother. Now, if I turn the photo around, we have another 4-generation shot. And this one shows now a little boy. The photo is taken in 1929. It's my brother. And of course now the women who are in the photograph have all moved generationally one notch. And now it's my mother as an adult, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother. I'm not here yet. I'll be along shortly. A couple more photographs. My grandmother, probably about the time that she got married. I don't have an exact date on the photograph, but looks very much like my mother. My mother will be along eventually. She was born, as I said, in 1904. And then the other picture I have is of my grandfather, my mother's dad. Handsome-looking gentleman. When I knew him, he didn't have nearly as much hair. I'm lucky to somehow have escaped the genetic tendency to follow your maternal grandfather, so I have a lot of hair. 1926, my mother and my father had met and decided to get married. And here they are in front of an art gallery. I assume that's what people in those days did when they went on a honeymoon. I guess Club Med hadn't come on the scene yet. Anyway, you've already met my brother, and in 1930, I arrive. Now, let me say a few words about my parents and their what my dad did for a living, sort of an introduction. He was in sales. He was not a college graduate. That wasn't traditional in Germany at that time. Very few people had a college or university experience. My dad was essentially self-taught. He was a salesman, worked for a company owned by 2 Jewish men. They traded in steel products, and he was like a sheet and rod and that type of steel product. And he lived in a very nice area of Berlin known as Wilmersdorf, not too far from the famous Kurfürstendamm, or Kudamm as it's called, a street with wonderful shops and restaurants and boutiques. And it was an area that was heavily Jewish. It was the most Jewish part of Berlin. Strangely enough, my parents were not religious. I think we went from one end of the year to the other and never had any kind of religious occasion, never celebrated any holidays, nothing in my life to note the fact that I was Jewish. That's an important point, because when I am 5 years old and I'm ready to go to kindergarten, this is a picture of my kindergarten. Obviously, one can note right away it's a small class. There's only 9 kids here, 7 girls, 2 boys. I'm number 3 from the front. And of course the question would be, what am I doing in such a small kindergarten class? And the answer is, it was run by a lady named Aunt Millie, or Tante Millie as she was called there. It was a Jewish kindergarten. So the question is, what am I doing there? The answer, of course, is my parents knew from talking to their friends that it was not safe for Jewish kids to be in a mixed class. I'm talking 1935. The Nazis have been in power for 2.5 years at this point. So already things are happening in schools. Jewish kids are being harassed and maybe beaten up, and my mother didn't want that for me. Now, the next year, I'm off to public school, and I could walk to that school from my house. It was perhaps 6 blocks. And in fact, when I went back in 1997 with my wife, and we were now guests of the city of Berlin, I could go directly to that school as though I had never left Berlin, and it was 60 years later. I got a rude shock, however. I walked to the school, told my wife exactly where to turn, and we stood in front of this building. There's a sign in front of the building that identified it as a Catholic elementary school. Now, I said that my parents were not religious, but they also hadn't converted. So what am I doing in a Catholic school? It was a surprise to me. I didn't know it. I called my cousin. She's older, and I thought she lives in Germany, and I thought that she might have had some insight into the situation. And she said, well, of course you went to that school. Your parents and my parents discussed this thing at great length, and they decided that you had to go to the Catholic school. Everyone knows that Catholic schools have better discipline, and there'd be less likelihood of something going wrong there. Well, that cleared up the mystery, but I also know that sometime in 1937, perhaps early 38, I had to leave that school. I couldn't, by law, I could no longer be in a mixed class. Mixed, that means Christian and Jewish kids. My brother and I both were sent now to a Jewish private school. Now, instead of walking to our school, we had to take public transportation. It meant getting on a streetcar and then changing at a transfer point. It was a long trip. The Jewish community of Berlin had created a number of private schools for Jewish kids, and they had to now add more of them. The one that I went to was the largest of them. It was run by a woman who had a connection with Cambridge University. The school was essentially a prep school for Cambridge, so it didn't hurt. I went to a very fine school. Some of the other schools had to be created sort of on the fly to take care of the sudden increase in enrollment. So in our area of Berlin, which I said was heavily Jewish, there were 6 private schools for Jewish kids, suddenly. Now the question that puzzled me was, why couldn't I stay in my class? You know, what was the underlying reason? And I've been wrestling with that question because I've been giving talks since 1995 for quite some time, and then in 2001 I thought I found the answer. I want to show the cover of a book. This book is called, in German, Der Giftpilz. It's a well-known anti-Semitic book today. This cover came off the internet. The book in English is called The Poisonous Mushroom. And the book contains a collection of anti-Semitic stories for children. If you want to imagine the typical German parent might read a story out of this book to a child before it goes to sleep. Now, there is actually a story in here called The Poisonous Mushroom. And the story goes like this. A mother is taking her little boy collecting mushrooms in the forest, an activity that many Germans would undertake. And the mother cautions the boy, be careful, don't pick any poisonous mushrooms. You know what'll happen. If we eat one of those, we could die. And then she wants to make the connection and says, now, do you know who the poisonous mushrooms of humanity are? And the little boy says, of course, Mother, I know. Our teacher told us many times in class, it's the Jews. They are like the poisonous mushrooms. And she says, yes, you have it right. And she finishes this little account by saying, just like one poisonous mushroom can kill a family, one Jew can poison a town or a whole community or an entire people. And when I read that story, it suddenly hit me that what the Germans were saying is Jews are poisonous. And the poison is something that you can't get rid of. It's inherent in the individual. And therefore, you have to remove these toxic individuals from the classroom. Otherwise, you risk poisoning the other people in the class. I don't know if this is the right reason or the right basis, but it makes sense. And of course, we know from the subsequent history of what happened that the Germans went much further than simply isolating people and moving them into ghettos. I mean, ultimately, there was all the destruction. My story doesn't have anything to do with that, but I'm simply making the point. I think I see a reason here. Now, I want to also show one other thing, and this goes along with the notion of Jews being toxic. This is a board game, or let me say it's a black and white reproduction of a board game, and the board game is called Jews Out. The board game was being sold in Germany at the same time as the book was being sold, and the board game works like most. You have game pieces, you have a track, you have dice. And each player in turn throws dice and gets a number and can move his game piece along the track. And the idea is to land on a house or a business owned by a Jew. And if you do that, you can evict that Jew from his residence or his business. And the first person that gets 6 Jews wins the game. Now, in our modern view of society, we think this is horrendous, you know. And even today in Germany, you can't find a copy of this game. You can't find a copy of that book. They're outlawed. But this actually was going on. People were literally playing with their children. This game is billed as a totally festive party game for adults and children. And this is what was going on in 1938. I want to now take a little bit of a detour from my story and also physically, geographically. In an area of Berlin not far from where I lived, one can find a very interesting display today. I'm holding here pictures of a sign. The sign is in an area of Berlin known as Schöneberg. It's adjacent to Wilmersdorf. And these signs are perhaps 2.5 by 3.5 feet. Some are landscape and some are portrait in orientation. And each one has on it a legend, and that is an anti-Jewish piece of legislation. On one side you have the law, on the back side you have a graphic that goes with the law. Now the one I'm holding is one of the earliest anti-Jewish laws promulgated. This is a law that dates to March 31, 1933, a month after the Nazis have come to power. And this law says that if you are a Jewish physician and you are treating patients, you cannot be paid by the insurance plan. Most physicians were paid by the plan. In other words, this law says that Jewish physicians are put out of business. It's an incredible law. It has enormous economic impact, and it isn't just physicians that are involved. The same kind of law also applied to university professors, to judges, to attorneys, CPAs, dentists, pharmacists. The entire professional class of Berlin and much of Germany was immediately affected. Not too much later, in August of the same year, 1933, there was a law that said that Jews could not be in choral groups. Well, I sing. I'm in a choir. This law would have said that as of August the 16th of 1933, I couldn't sing in a choir. This is obviously a different law. This is a law that affects not your business, it affects something about quality of life, what you like to do. And I want to take a couple of more of these just to make the point. In 1935, a law was passed that said that groups of Jewish kids of 20 or more were no longer permitted to go on hikes in the countryside. That's sort of goes to the same point as you can't sing anymore in a choir. Why would the Germans pass such laws? Why would they trouble themselves with this kind of thing? And of course the answer is easy. The Germans didn't want the Jews to make money, so they banned them from professions. They also didn't want them to be socializing with non-Jews, so any kind of mixed activity like children playing. Here's a hopscotch sign. This is 1938, and this says that Aryan means Christian, and non-Aryan, meaning Jewish, children can't play together. The same idea. We don't want Jewish and non-Jewish people or children mixing together. I'll show one final sign because I think it gets to the point of how the Jewish community might respond to such a thing. It was certainly a problem to be barred from various professional activities. My father happened to be in an area that was not banned, so he was able to keep on working. But many Jewish people might have said, I can't manage this. I think I'll convert. So let's consider the possibility of somebody attempting to convert as a way of escaping the anti-Jewish laws. And now I have one sign that addresses this possibility. This is a law dating to April of 1936. The Germans were very clever, and they knew that conversion was a possibility. Well, this law says it very clearly. Conversion and baptism will not be considered in questions relating to matters of race. So you might want to convert, but you are Jewish underneath, and you will remain Jewish. And all the laws that we have promulgated that apply to you will continue to apply to you. So you might want to convert, but that won't work. So that's not an escape mechanism. Well, I've returned now to my story. This is what's going on around me, and of course, as a kid of 6, 7, 8, I'm totally oblivious to this. I'm going to my school, and in 1938, I have actually had my first romance when my brother and I go to my school. I get off one stop before the end of the line, and I have a girlfriend that I pick up every morning, and we walk that one extra stop, and that's my first romance. She was actually an older woman. She was 2 years older than I, and I don't know whatever happened to her. Unfortunately, many of the friendships ended in mystery. We never knew where many of our friends wound up. In November of 1938, something happened in Germany. Today we call it Kristallnacht here, the night of broken glass. The Germans don't call it that. They have a different name. It's called the Reichspogromnacht. That means the night of the governmentally organized pogrom. I think what they're trying to do by changing the name is to make it real. Crystal Night has almost a beautiful sound to it. It could be a starry night on a summer evening. It was anything but that. It was November 9th, and on that night, unbeknownst to my family and to me, the German mobs, urged on by the government, ransacked synagogues all over the country. There were 267 that we know were set ablaze that night. They went into shops, smashed windows, they looted. They knew where Jewish people lived. They went into homes of Jewish families, dragged men into the street and beat them up. We know of at least 30 that were murdered by being beaten to death. And the final thing that they did was they arrested 30,000 men. Now, the Jewish population of Germany at that time was something like 500,000. And 30,000 men represents a fairly high percentage of the adult population. My father was one of these. I said that we didn't know anything about what was going on. My parents saw my brother and me off that next morning, the 10th. We went to school. I picked up my girlfriend as usual. We went to school and immediately were pulled into an assembly and told to go home. Don't stop anywhere. Just go straight home. I remember on the way to the school seeing a building that I knew to be a synagogue. It had been set on fire and it was still smoldering. And so I know something was up, but I didn't really know then. It took me until my brother and I got home. My father was in the living room of our apartment with a strange man. My mother didn't explain. She simply said, go to the corner bakery, here's some money, get your father some hard rolls and bring them back. And we did that. And then my dad went with this stranger. Later I knew he was a Gestapo man who had come to arrest him. And he was gone. Now I enter a period of memory loss, essentially until the day he comes back. I do recall perhaps 2 occasions when my uncle came for an evening conversation with my mother. They always went into another room and closed the door. Something was going on. We didn't know what. I have reason to believe that my uncle and my mother were planning some means of getting my dad out of concentration camp. Of course, I didn't know that he had been taken away there. I just knew he was gone. And as I say, I have no memory of any detail. as an example, I asked my brother many times, did we go to school in the weeks following? My dad was gone for 6 weeks. What did we do? Did we play? Did we stay at home? He didn't know either. He had the same memory loss that I had. And that's very common. I've met many people who've had this kind of an experience and they blocked it out. I have no interest in recapturing it. I'm simply, I'm dealing with the reality. I just can't recall. On the 23rd of December, my dad comes back. I remember that very clearly. The reason is my father came back and presented my brother and me each with some object that I'd never seen before or since. A chocolate-covered banana. Where he got this, how he got it, I have absolutely no idea. But apparently he found this, had the money in his pocket, and was bringing it as kind of a hello, I'm back offering. My father was a mess. He stank. He was filthy. He had been someplace where he couldn't take a bath. Germans don't, by and large, shower, but they bathe. When he took off his clothes, I could tell that he had been badly beaten. He had bruises and scabs and cuts all over him. And my mother, who was as fastidious as he was, immediately got him into a tub and got him cleaned up. He never spoke about his experience in the concentration camp, to my regret, never. And so what I know about his experience, I know only from having read other people's accounts who had been in the same camp, or by going there myself. And we did go in 2006. But I want to show this picture because I think it's very important. This is my father's ID card. And I want to make the point that my father didn't have hair that looked like what is shown in this picture. This is the residue of having been in a camp where they shaved all the hair off the prisoners' heads. He also had what I consider a somber look. He was always, he wasn't always like this, but frequently, and certainly any time we tried to get any information about his experience in the camps, that would be the kind of a look I'd get. By the way, this ID card has on the front of it what's called a Gothic J. This identifies him as a Jew. The card, of course, is an enlargement. The actual card is perhaps a quarter of the size of this. So my dad came home, and he was given 90 days to leave the country. And he was told if he didn't leave, he was subject to rearrest. So he had a very large incentive to try and get himself and us out of Germany. No small undertaking. There were very few countries that wanted Jewish immigrants. But my father had something going for him that some people didn't. He had an uncle in London, and the uncle and an aunt, and they had a flat. They had room for 2 people, so my mother and father were taken care of. There was also a movement afoot started in England called the Kindertransport, and I'll talk in a moment about the Kindertransport, but I want to stay with my dad for a moment. So he arranged for his own transportation, and he registered my brother and me with the Kindertransport. I was chosen to go on that journey, and my dad followed me, so I was the first one out. And now I want to show a picture of my passport. Again, this is an enlargement, and it has a few features that I want to point out. The first one is, most obvious, is the red J here on the front page. The origin of the red J is now known. It was not the Germans who put this on. Let's say it was the Germans who put it on, but they were urged to do it by the Swiss government. The Swiss were being overrun with people trying to get out of Germany. And in 1938, the Swiss appealed to the German government to help them put some identifying mark on a passport so that they could turn Jewish people away at the border. And the Germans said, we can do that, and the red J is the result. Other features of this interesting document are my middle name. It may not show clearly, but my middle name was Siegfried, after my grandfather, my father's dad. And by law, I now also became, like every Jewish male, I became an Israel. So my new name is Stefan Siegfried Israel Adler. Women, girls, or adult women were Sarah. That was the law. Unless you happened to have the name Israel or Sarah already, then you didn't have to change. Now I'll open the passport. There I am, age 8, stamped with eagles that are clutching a swastika. And other interesting marks are the stamp here, the triangular stamp, that shows that in 1940, November, I left England and went from Liverpool to the United States. So the history of my wandering is all on here. It shows that I left Germany from the port of Hamburg, and then there's also a stamp here on the front that shows that I was let into England at the port of Southampton. So the history is all on this one document. It's a good thing because some of these things I don't actually remember. Now, a few words about the Kindertransport. The British didn't really want immigration in 1938, but there was a strong popular sentiment in the country, led not only by Jewish people but by liberals who felt that the British had to do something to rescue Jewish children. And the British decided to, in late 1938, to allow 10,000 Jewish kids to come into the country. And these were from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, the 3 countries that were affected. I was one of the 10,000. Now, I have a brochure from the Kindertransport Association that's interesting only because it shows kids leaving from different places and heading to England. This, for example, is a photograph of children taken, I believe it's in Rotterdam, which is one of the ports for departure. And I don't have a picture of me, but you can look at these children and I think you can see what I might have looked like. It was March. I was obviously wearing some kind of a heavy coat. I had a little number tag attached to my collar, and I was carrying some object, maybe a small suitcase or a toy, or some of these kids were carrying musical instruments. And the number has nothing to do with the tattoo numbers that we know about later on. These were identification numbers. When a child came to a port, either to get onto a ship or to get off a ship, the adults had to check to make sure that they didn't lose anybody on the way. So we were all numbered, and these adults could then check our numbers against a master list and make sure that they had everybody accounted for. So we left from, in my case, from Hamburg. I had no idea at that time if I would ever see my parents again. as I say, I don't even remember being in Hamburg. I only know it retrospectively because I can see the information on my passport. When I get to the Channel coast of France and the ship stopped in Le Havre, then all of a sudden I knew where I was. I knew I was in a strange place. The people were speaking a language I couldn't understand. It was French. It could have been in England because I didn't understand English either. Oh, I should say, my mother did teach me one sentence in English. Kids in Germany learn English fairly early, so my brother had already been taking English in school, but I was only 8, so I wasn't ready for that yet. So my mother taught me one sentence, and she was a practical woman. She taught me to say, "Where's the WC? Where's the bathroom?" She knew I'd get fed, and she knew that if I got tired, I'd lie down. So she figured, well, there's one other thing I better teach my son. So I arrived in England with this one sentence. I was supposed to be met by my father's uncle. The train went from Southampton to London, and we arrived were brought into some kind of a large reception hall. Now you have to understand that we have here hundreds of children on a train, all German or Czech or Austrian. Few of them have any English skills. The first thing that we did, we all got lunch in Southampton, a little cardboard box. And so the train ride north to London, one of the big activities was opening the box and seeing what was inside. And there was a bottle of milk, a glass bottle, of course, an apple, 2 slices of bread, and a metal tin that one kid figured out how to open up. It was a tin that had a kind of a roll top on it, like you might get from a sardine can. So we all did that, and then the kids were exploring what was in the tin. It was some kind of a pink slab of meat with little fat globules on it, and one kid must have tried that and maybe sniffed at it and then tasted it and found that it tasted pretty good. So we all dove in and had our first piece of English corned beef. That was quite an experience. We got to London, and we were taken to the reception center where all the kids were met by somebody. There were uncles and aunts and cousins and other relatives that were meeting these children arriving in a strange country, and they were being taken away to some family reunion, except for one kid from Prague and for me. The two of us had nobody. My uncle stood me up. I never found out why. I needed badly to be met by a kind relative who would, welcome me and say something comforting, and he wasn't there. But we were taken by a chauffeur in a limousine, taken to a very luxurious home, and that turned out to be the home that we were going to be staying in. My uncle, that is my great uncle, showed up that afternoon. He was carrying all kinds of gifts to appease me because he had done this horrible thing to me. Chocolate bars, money to buy more chocolate, postcards and stamps, and a fountain pen. We didn't have ballpoints in those days. It was a fountain pen. And he said, look, and if you are unhappy about anything, just write me a card and let me know. And I don't know what he intended to do about it. But anyway, that was my first day in London. My second day in London, I took the money that he gave me and I found out where to buy more chocolate bars. The money was gone in no time. So I spent my first 6 months in London living in this house with 20 other kids, and my parents eventually arrived in England also. My father, and then my mother. So by May, they were both in London, living with his uncle and aunt. And somehow, and I cannot even say how this was done, somehow I managed to get from where I was living to visit my parents. I have no idea how this was arranged. I was only 8. I knew nothing about London. I couldn't negotiate the public transit system. Did somebody drive me? Did I go by bus? I have no idea. All I know is I did visit with them. In fact, one visit, I had learned a card trick, and I showed them how to make the King of Hearts disappear. And my mother, years later, told me that I was so successful at it that when they tried to play bridge the following evening, they couldn't do it because the king was gone. They had an incomplete deck. So that was my beginning experience in London. Of course, I went to school immediately with the other kids. It was total immersion, and in no time at all, I was fluent in English. There were no other options. And then the war started. It was September. The British were terrified that children would be trapped in London and other large cities, and the Germans would bomb and perhaps injure or kill kids. So they decided to solve that problem by simply removing all the school children. And entire school populations were taken out of London and moved en masse to other locations, so that the schools stayed intact, but simply moved elsewhere. My school was moved to a small town, almost a village, you might say, of Abbots Langley. Abbots Langley is so small that the postal address listed as near Watford. Otherwise, the postman might not find it. We were taken to this little town, each one carrying a gas mask in a cardboard canister. The British had decided that there might be gas attacks, and we were taken into this strange little town, marched down streets, and told, you go in here, you go in here, and we were simply billeted. I mean, that's the proper term, billeted with strange people. So I was billeted in a house, small house, with another kid from our home, and we got to sleep in the attic. It was an unheated house. There had no central plumbing, there was no heating. The only heat was a fireplace or a gas heater. It was very crude. I came from Berlin, and Berlin was 20th century living, and this was kind of a return to maybe 18th century. But I was very fortunate. I was the woman who was a decent human being. She was very kind to me. So I was there for 9 months. Sometime in April, May of 1940, I was, again, I have to use the word somehow because I don't know any other way to say it. Somehow, I was sent to live with my brother. And I don't know how I got there. Suddenly I'm no longer in Abbots Langley living with Mrs. Williams. Now I'm living with my brother in High Wycombe, perhaps 20 miles away. And this is now a home run by the Quakers, the Society of Friends. They were good people. I wish they wouldn't have forced us to go to church every Sunday morning, but I did go to church. I learned to sing Christian hymns long before I ever sang a Jewish hymn. We were required to sit attentively in church every Sunday morning, sing things like Nearer My God to Thee and Rock of Ages. And when the alms plate was passed, we were expected to put money on the plate. How we were going to have money to put on the plate, I don't know whoever had that idea, but one of our group had this brilliant idea. When the plate came by to pick up a coin and then drop it. It was a metal plate, and of course it made a very wonderfully large clinking sound, and this same coin was picked up and dropped 15 or 20 times as it went down our row because we had no money to give. By the summer, my parents, first my mother, and then my father finally were released, and I should back up here and say my parents were Germans, adults, and when the war started, the British government decided that my parents were enemy aliens. They classified them as enemy aliens. After all, they were adults from a country with which Britain was at war. And because of that, they were sent to an internment camp. Now, my father had just come out of a concentration camp in Germany, and almost immediately he had to go into an internment camp. He started in an abandoned racing stable. The men went first, and then in time the British put up a camp on the Isle of Man. That's a small island that's in the Irish Sea. The men were on one side of the island and the women on the other, and the British did arrange for the men and the women to have conjugal visits, so there was at least some semblance of normal operations. But essentially from October until the middle of October of 39 until the middle of 1940, these people were living in these internment camps. And then the British, for whatever reason, decided that some or all of the people were okay, they were not German spies, and they began to release them. So my mother came out. She immediately arranged to get my brother and me to come and live with her, and we lived in London. And then about 2 or 3 months later, my dad showed up in September, and after that we began moving around the city, living with friends of ours, or friends of my parents, often in air raid shelters because the German Blitz was already on. The Germans were making nightly bombing runs on London. And that's how we lived until November of 1940, when my father had arranged passage on a ship, and we got the necessary papers so we could come to the United States. So November 7, 1940, we leave from Liverpool. It takes 12 days to make this voyage across the Atlantic, and we wound up first in Halifax, and then we wound up in New York City. And finally we came to Chicago because my father needed a sponsor. He had a good friend who was a physician who could afford to put up the money. So we went to Chicago, where the sponsor lived. And I started in Chicago schools, went through elementary and high school, eventually wound up in college and graduate school. And along the way I met the woman who became my wife. We were in the same temple religious youth group. It was a youth group. And my wife walked in one day. I happened to be the president of the organization at that time, and my words were, "How do you do? My name is Steve Adler." I had changed my name from Stefan to Steve. And I welcome you to our youth group. And my wife decided that she perhaps might want to go out with me, and so we became high school friends, sweethearts, and eventually got married. I want to come back to two items that kind of left behind. The first, I want to talk about my grandparents. These are pictures that I showed earlier of my grandparents. When we left Berlin in 1939, my grandparents had no place to go. It was very difficult for Jews to go anywhere. So I'm not sure if it was money only or the opportunity, but they stayed behind. And in 1942 they were picked up in a deportation. The Germans regularly deported Jewish people out of Berlin and other cities. And they went on a train on the 18th of August 1942. They were sent to Riga, Latvia, and now we know from some records that we obtained that when they arrived they were murdered. The entire trainload of Jews was murdered. A few years ago I had the opportunity to be in Berlin, and I knew about this program of placing stones in the sidewalk in front of buildings. This is a program started by a German man, and he had been installing these, what he called stumbling stones, all over Germany, in every city, Cologne, Hamburg, Frankfurt, Berlin. And I made inquiries. I found out how to, as they say, adopt two of these stones together with my brother. And we decided that we would place two stones in front of the building where my grandparents had lived. And we were in Berlin in 2006, actually saw the stones. These are the photographs. And a month after we were there, they were placed in the sidewalk, and they are now a permanent part of the city of Berlin. And the idea of the stone anyway is that when somebody is walking along the street, he might notice that these stones are a little bit raised above the surface of the pavement, and look down, and then they will see the writing on the stone, and it in very brief form tells what happened to these two people, Margarete Liebmann, my grandmother, and Julius Liebmann, my grandfather. I mentioned my wife. Her family also comes from Germany. She was born in Chicago, and she had very large losses in her family in the Holocaust, as did I. And I want to show this photograph, perhaps to end what I want to say. This is a picture of a child 10 months old. This is the son of her uncle and aunt. The uncle and aunt were caught in Holland. They were imprisoned first in Westerbork, which is a transit camp. Then they were sent to Theresienstadt in what is today the Czech Republic. Somewhere in their journey they had a child. We don't know where, probably in Holland. From Theresienstadt, the three of them, the father, the mother, and this little kid, were shipped off to Auschwitz, and we just know that the child and the parents were murdered. We happen to have this picture because my wife, Judy, had a relative in the same camp, a great uncle, who somehow got this photograph of this little boy, and it was on the back of a postcard, and he had sent that postcard to my wife's father, and we have that card today. It's the only evidence that exists that this child ever was there, that this child ever lived. And I think it's important to show pictures like this. I was a child too. I happened to be older than Hans Philipp. I was 8 when I left. This kid was 10 months old or 12 months old. He never had a chance. So in a sense, when I speak about my experience, I feel as if I have a kind of a debt to children like this one. Now I want to say some concluding things about why am I doing this? What is the whole point? Many people say never again. Fine, I agree, never again, but I want to say never again what? and I think the what is the important thing. Many people had an opportunity in the early years of the Nazi regime to protest, to resist, to say no, we're not going to go along with this. It could have been the non-Jewish physicians saying, you can't do this to our colleagues, or it could have been the judges who could have said the same thing, or any of these professional groups. Any of them could have said it. And there's almost no evidence of any kind of protest. So in my view, there was a failure in the society to make a protest when it could have had an impact. And so I agree, never again. Never again being silent when speaking out can make a difference. I go to many schools, I talk to lots of teachers, and they all tell me the same story. There are things happening in the schools that are unjust, improper, wrong, and they all know it. The kids know it. And they're looking for a way to get the message out that the kids have to stand up with people who are being singled out because they're different. That's my goal. I try to explain to them what happens in a society when people don't do this. And we are living in this society. This is our chance. Now we have the opportunity. So I'm hoping that the message gets out and that I can make a difference. Thank you.